right? So we're going to take the complicated, we're going to make it simple. We may talk to you like your kids. Please forgive us for that, but you'll be talking to kids at some point in your life. So we want to take these complicated conversations and make them very, very simple. Does that make sense? Okay. So then we're going to tell the story of ourselves in America. And then we're going to pause for reflection, and you will receive a prompt.
We will then resume our journey in and through the greatest era in U.S. history, which began on June 19, 1865. We will pause for reflection. There will be another prompt question for you to answer, for you to consider and reflect on. We'll then talk about the Revolutionary era. And finally, we will summarize and synthesize our journey through Juneteenth. Then, as we wrap it up, it will be your turn to contribute and participate in our Common Ground conversation today. So we begin with a very common frame of reference. We all have a home. It is our earth home. And we all live in one home. We are all a part of the human race. And we are all a part of one family. It's the human family. And we have this conversation and this languaging in our home all the time because it is really that simple. We are one human family. We value all humans the same. Should we place different values on the lives of our human family based on their skin color? How would a child answer that question? Our adult society ascribes a different value to humans based on race, and kids are then taught these values in home, in school, in media, and their faith community.
Talking to kids, they see the colors, they see the differences, they value them the same, and that is important.
And it really brings us to a basic philosophy. This is a basic philosophy in the greenhouse. And it's a philosophy of consideration. How do we treat one another, right? And we build upon the word considerate. And so if we had our kids come in here right now and we said, what does it mean to be considerate? They would say it means to be kind, generous, and sharing. Considerate, kind, generous, and sharing.
Let's start with the story of ourselves. Now, the visiting team were just as surprised to arrive on a continent that was already occupied. But what surprised them the most was that no one claimed ownership of the land and the resources. So they made a decision, we're gonna take this, it's gonna be ours. So in this early arrival of white humans to the home of brown humans, two core ideals came into conflict. Individual ownership of land and resources versus a social contract of sharing the land and resources. So imagine the natives could not understand who's owning the air. No one owns the air, no one owns the land, no one owns the water. And that was an opportunity because white humans that arrived here early viewed ownership as a pathway to personal wealth. So naturally, there was a battle. The native people didn't like the idea of the new arrivals taking so much of their land and resources, yet the warnings that they continued to give them, by the way, they gave them warnings for 100 years before there was actual battle. And yet those warnings were ignored. So they formed a confederacy of 30 tribes and they fought to defend their homeland. Now the visitors, they were determined to own the land and resources because ownership represents to them an opportunity to build great wealth. And they had come a long way and they were determined. So as word spread throughout the homeland of the white visitors that there was free land for the taking in the new land, more white visitors arrived and they took more land from the natives. And with so much more land, the white humans needed more help. So, since the natives weren't cooperating, they imported people from Africa and enslaved them. Now, the first shipment of Africans arrived at Point Comfort near Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, and the New York Times, much to their credit, and during the 400-year anniversary last year, did a great 1619 project. I encourage you to take a look at it. The settlers did not consider these new arrivals humans. They were viewed as commodities, and they were bought and sold like animals. And they were forced to work on the lands taken by the settlers through war with the natives.
And this picture is so powerful because it says they didn't steal slaves. They stole scientists, doctors, architects, teachers, entrepreneurs, astronomers, mothers, sons, daughters, etc., and they made them slaves.
If you tell them this story, they can't understand that. Whose idea was that? So we start with the founding fathers. Now, throughout our presentation, we'll talk about multiple founders because the original founders of this country were not the only founders.
That's right.
So there were co-founders along the way. But in 1775, the settlers declared war on their own homeland of England. Now, they weren't fighting for freedom. I mean, they had freedom. They had the freedom to come here. They had freedom to take the land. They had freedom to build cities. They had freedom to build institutions. And most of that they built with slave labor. So the new nation that they formed, they had the freedom to determine the course of that nation. And they determined that it was going to be a whites-only citizen. So rather than consider all humans with equal value, the white settlers subscribed to the belief of racial hierarchy, which is a ladder of value placed on humans based on skin color and lineage. Now, white people considered themselves superior to all others, so they were valued at the top. And they considered black people to be closer to animals, and so they were least valued. So white supremacy, as we've come to know that, is rooted in a belief of racial hierarchy, which values white people the most and devalues all others, with black people at the bottom. When you say the word race to me, I filter it to mean racial hierarchy. So we should not be afraid to talk about racial hierarchy, because racial hierarchy is about the value of humans. Why should we be afraid to talk about that? And children are not afraid to talk about that. They easily understand that all humans are valued the same. The reason I think we're afraid to talk about racial hierarchy or race is because we don't want to talk about white supremacy. And that's a tough thing to talk about, but guess what? We have to do it if we're going to build a more inclusive society. So even in the northern states where black people were not enslaved, they were not considered citizens of the United States. They risked being captured and dragged from a free state into a slave state where they would be bought and sold as a commodity. White Americans formed their own nation. They agreed on the question of removing natives from their homes, and many of them from the planet itself. But they struggled with the question of what to do with black people. Black people didn't own any land. Black people didn't have any place to go. And black people represented free labor, so they had some value for the farmers in the South. But the Northerners did not agree that black people should be enslaved. So
although they were not.
Oh yeah, although they were not equal citizens to white, so there's still that white supremacy there. And during the formation of this country, that became the quintessential question. What are we going to do with black people? As you join the union, your state, you're joining the union, the question you had to answer that would define your state is, what are you going to do with your black people? Slave or slave free? And that continued throughout the 1800s. And as you can see, as we move through the 1800s, there was almost an equal number of slave states and free states. But as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, the slave states took a slight edge. The slave-free states took a slight edge. And then Civil War, 1861. Now, when the Civil War ended in 1865, you now have 4 million newly freed black people coming out of bondage. And the question that the new nation had to answer is, what are we going to do with all these black people? So that did not change. Now, although Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, no one had cell phones then. So it took a while for the Army to travel to all the southern states and notify both the white people and the enslaved black people that black freedom had arrived. And that message reached the last enslaved black people on Galveston Island near Houston, Texas, on June 19, 1865, Freedom Day. That's what we're celebrating today, Juneteenth, where white Americans fought each other in a civil war over the fate of black people. And that war between white people with the aid of black people resulted in the freedom of black people in America. Hallelujah. That should be a national holiday.
And so now we have a question for you. That was a lot of information, and it feels like it comes fast and there's a lot. But I'd love for you to think, and if you're comfortable answering in the chat, how does this story of ourselves compare with the story you've been told? And or what stands out from you or for you? And this era is, we call it the greatest era. It's commonly called Reconstruction in history books, right? Is that kind of a name that some people might, and somebody asked about that in the chat. But
it is commonly called Reconstruction because what were they trying to do? They were trying to take a whites-only nation and transform it into an inclusive America. And so when you try to do that after a war, you've got to rebuild, redesign, reconstruct. And of course, that's not happening in unison. That's not happening in collaboration. That's happening in conflict. White people are still struggling with one another. The white radicals who had a progressive idea that these new citizens are going to be equal to us and they're going to be treated equal to us. And we're going to empower them through the federal government because the private sector wasn't going to do that. In fact, the private sector tried to undermine them. The private sector said you couldn't buy anything in our businesses. You couldn't do business with us. You couldn't even own a business near us. The private sector said you couldn't live near us, not in my backyard. And so it was the federal government. The states didn't want to do it. The federal government had to intervene on behalf of the fate of the future of black people. They also had to build colleges because the white colleges would not allow black people to come to the white colleges. And therefore, you have 100+ black colleges between the Civil War and the time Dr. King gave his iconic speech on the Washington Mall in 1963. You had more than 100 historically black colleges and universities built in that time frame. One of the first ones right after the Civil War was at Clark, Atlanta, in the home of Dr. King. So this, in my opinion, was one of the greatest eras in US history. And the priority focus was on the empowerment and inclusion of Black Americans.
We have a little pause for you and another question that I really would love to hear. And again, we just raced through 7 extraordinary highlights. I would love to know, we would love to know, what would you say was the greatest achievement of that, the greatest era? Share with us in the text here. Liam said that the idea of giving 40 acres and a mule. And River said she likes that within 7 years, there were Black men in the legal system. The creation of HBCUs, Linda Miller, absolutely, that's right. Oh, I like this one. Tom, thank you for this. The willingness of the white radicals to defy the status quo in order to bring decency and humanity to all Americans. Let's drop the mic on that. This is beautiful, Heather. The right view of humanity breaking through in advocacy of one another. And Amy says she loves the phrase that you used, empowerment and inclusion of Black Americans. She just learned about this last year. That's right. So let's move into the Revolutionary era, huh?
So we'll leave the greatest era in US history and we enter into the Revolutionary era. Now, the Revolutionary era started with white supremacists waging war against black people. It ended with the death of Dr. King in 1968 at the end of what is known as the Negro Revolution. So let's start with what happened. I think someone asked that. What happened?
Right, that's right.
Well, in 1872, there was an Amnesty Act, and the white supremacists in the South resumed their political power. Now, keep in mind, they still wanted a whites-only nation. And that compromise removed all of the troops that were protecting black people in the South. And when they removed that protection, to coin a term, all hell broke loose. Black people were being chased down and killed every day. By the time you get to 1895, more than 53,000 black people have been slaughtered. And that's just the ones they know about. By 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in and said that, yeah, America officially is a black and white nation. That whole inclusion thing, no, that failed. That failed with Reconstruction. No, this is a black and white nation, with a white, wealthy, and powerful populace, and a black and poor and powerless populace.
And that was okay.
And that was okay. Now that's 1896. So then we get to the next part of the Revolutionary era, because black people had been fleeing the South in droves, called the Great Migration, for 70 years. They were headed north, they were headed west, they were headed wherever they could. And wherever they landed, they found problems. Wherever they landed, they were put into red-line communities. Wherever they landed, they were told that they had to live in ghettos. Wherever they landed, white people were telling them, not in my backyard. And so by 1963, and you all know that in 1954, the Supreme Court had a change of heart and said, you know what, we need to desegregate these schools with all deliberate speed. Well, if you read Dr. King's book, that didn't happen, because right after that, they put in the pupil placement law, which completely nullified the Supreme Court ruling on desegregation. Dr. King wrote about it in his book, Why We Can't Wait. The very first chapter is called The Negro Revolution, Why 1963? My question is, why aren't we teaching our children this in every school? Why aren't we reading this? Because he tells you, and he lays it out, exactly why Black Americans orchestrated a nonviolent direct action protest in nearly 1,000 cities. Now, you just witnessed protests in nearly 1,000 cities, and you can't forget that. But we still, to this day, don't know that that happened in 1963. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress. In 1965, Malcolm X was killed. Police were attacking protesters in Selma, Alabama. The LA riots rose up. This was a war. This was a revolution rising up against the white supremacist war. And every school on Martin Luther King Day talks about, I have a dream. And nobody knows that speech, because Dr. King didn't start with his dream, he started with his reality. And he said, and he talked about Lincoln, and then he said, 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, and he continues on. You should read the speech. Have your kids read the speech. I have my kids read that speech. And then he says, at the end of that first refrain, 100 years later, the Negro is still shackled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later. So, he says, we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. So now we're 100 years out of the Emancipation Proclamation. Black Americans are living in a shameful condition. They have been rooted up out of their homes, displaced out of their homes, a great migration for decades and generations. They have been killed, they have been raped, they have been convicted and falsely, they've gone through hell. And guess what? 80% of their families were still intact. Plain, Arkansas was another massacre. There were many, many, many white riots and many, many, many massacres. So let's not get too caught up on just one, because that occurred as a war over generations. Now, during that same time period, we were building communities, prosperous communities in Tulsa, in Harlem, in Durham. Black people continued to rise up, even in the midst of all of this, and rebuild. And then white people continued to systemically destroy those communities. In the 1950s and 60s, you had urban renewal. This is planning, this is zoning, this is now public policy. And they raised ubiquitously all of the Black communities across this nation. You go into any major city and go to a Black community, anywhere where there's a freeway, and people will tell you how that freeway got there, through public policy practices. Segregationist policies and practices were ubiquitous across this country in the 50s and 60s. By 1968, by the end of 1968, Nixon was elected president on a campaign of law and order. Nixon was a white supremacist who Black people specifically rose up against in 1960 to defeat him and elect JFK, who said that he would end discrimination in schools. He would end discrimination in housing. He would end discrimination in banking, which, by the way, in the last 10 years, banks have been fined $243 billion for discrimination. None of that's ended. We're still dealing with the same stuff. So now it's our turn. It's our turn. So let's do what they did in 1865. Let's do what they did at the start of Juneteenth. Let's build an inclusive America. Let's change the laws and change the policies. Let's accept people into this country and value them as equal to ourselves. Let's make sure that all of the kids are valued equally. Not have the wealthy kids be serviced by wealthy schools and the poor kids be serviced by our worst schools. Whose idea was that? Let's build an inclusive America together. That's our choice. Or we can maintain the status quo. That's up to you.